All right, so get ready because today we're going deep, really deep into metaphysics
Okay.
with Martin Heidegger's phenomenological interpretation of Kant's critique of pure reason.
Wow.
We've got excerpts from the book itself, and I know the title might sound a little intimidating,
Right.
but trust me, this isn't just some like dusty old philosophy.
Yes.
This is about understanding how we understand anything.
Absolutely.
And Heidegger,
Yeah.
even when he's tackling Kant, has this way of making these ideas click.
He does. He really does.
It's like we've got this backstage pass to the
Yeah.
minds of
I like that.
not one, but two philosophical heavyweights.
That's a great way to put it.
So I think a good place to start would be to tackle a word that I think gets thrown around a lot but rarely explained,
Oh.
and that word is metaphysics.
Right.
So what is Heidegger's take on that word?
Well, he actually starts with the words surprisingly humble origins, because metaphysics didn't start out as this grand concept, right?
Right.
It literally describes where Aristotle's writings on the subject were placed after his works on physics.
Oh, okay.
So in Greek, metaphysica, meaning after the physics.
So it's like somebody was just labeling a shelf and they accidentally created a whole branch of philosophy.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's a pretty low-key start for such a big idea.
It is a humble beginning for such a weighty topic.
Yeah.
But over time, it evolved into this whole realm of thought that grapples with those really big questions.
Yeah.
The ones that we all ponder at some point.
Yeah.
Like, what's the nature of reality? What does it even mean to be?
Right.
What is the foundation of everything that exists?
Yeah, those late night staring at the ceiling kind of questions.
Exactly, those big questions.
Yeah.
And Heidegger's point is that we're all engaged in metaphysics, whether we use that term or not.
Yeah.
That deep curiosity about the world and about our place in it.
Right.
It's a fundamental part of being human.
That makes me feel a little less intimidated by the whole, like, philosophy thing.
Good, good.
So Heidegger talks about this distinction between humans existing and things in nature just being extant.
Right.
Can you break that down for me a little bit?
Sure. Think of it this way. A rock, a tree, a cloud. They just are, right?
Okay.
They exist in the world,
Yeah.
but they don't actively engage with it the way that we do as humans.
Yeah.
We make choices, we form relationships, we question things.
Yeah.
We know things in a way that's fundamentally different from how, let's say, a rock knows the ground that it's sitting on.
Okay, so it's like there are levels to being.
Yeah.
The rock is just kind of there.
Right.
But humans, we exist in a richer sense because we interact with the world. We're
Right.
self-aware. We have this whole, like, inner world of thoughts and feelings.
Precisely. And for Heidegger, this difference in being, this existing, is actually what makes knowledge a possibility unique to humans.
I'm starting to see why Heidegger was so interested in Kant.
Yes.
Kant was all about figuring out, like, how we know things, right?
Absolutely. And Heidegger picks up on this really fascinating idea from Kant
Yeah.
that you can't really grasp or deal with anything
Okay.
unless you have some prior understanding of being.
Okay, I feel like I need an example
Okay, sure.
to wrap my head around that.
Imagine you're a scientist who's studying the origins of life.
Huh.
Before you can even begin your research,
Yeah.
you need to have some concept of what life itself is.
Right.
You need a framework for understanding what it means for something to be alive,
Right.
to have a history to evolve.
So even scientists who we think of as working with these, like, hard facts and evidence need this kind of philosophical grounding.
Absolutely. They need that understanding of being, as Heidegger calls it, to even make sense of the specific beings that they're studying.
Whoa, okay.
Right.
That's making me think about knowledge in a whole new way.
Good, good.
So we can't talk about Kant without mentioning his
Right.
famous Copernican revolution in philosophy.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, this isn't about astronomy.
No, not in the literal sense,
Okay.
but it is revolutionary.
Okay.
Kant really flipped the traditional way of thinking about knowledge on its head.
Okay.
Instead of our minds passively conforming to the world.
Okay.
He argued that the world, as we experience it, must conform to the structure of our minds.
Wait, so is he saying that we're all just, like, creating our own realities? That seems a little far out there.
Hold on. Heidegger actually clarifies this point.
Okay.
Kant isn't saying that reality is subjective, like that whatever you believe becomes true, right?
Right.
What he means is that our a priori knowledge, the stuff we know in advance, like basic categories of space and time shape how we experience things.
So, like, could you give me a real-world example of that?
Sure. Think about putting on a pair of sunglasses.
Okay.
Everything you see is tinted, right?
Right.
The objects themselves haven't changed, but your experience of them is filtered through those lenses.
Okay, so it's like our minds have like this built-in filter
Uh-huh.
that shapes how we perceive reality.
Exactly.
We're not creating the world out of thin air,
Right.
but we're shaping how it appears to us.
Precisely. And one of the most fundamental parts of that filter
Yeah.
for Kant is how we experience space and time.
Okay, so this is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah.
Kant didn't see space and time as things like out there, like physical objects.
Right.
He called them forms of intuition. What did he mean by that?
Well, he's basically saying that they're more like mental frameworks
Okay.
through which we experience everything.
Okay.
You literally can't perceive anything
Right.
without experiencing it in space and time.
So it's like space and time are the stage on which everything else plays out,
Yes.
but the stage itself isn't a physical thing.
Right.
It's the structure of how we perceive the world.
Exactly. And Heidegger goes into Kant's arguments for why space and time must be these free-given forms of intuition,
Okay.
not things that we learn from experience.
Okay.
So you can't, for example, you can't grasp the concept of next to
Right.
without already having some sense of space.
Right. Or before and after without a sense of time.
Exactly.
Like
Exactly.
they're the preconditions for any kind of experience at all.
They are.
But here's a question.
Yeah.
How did Kant deal with motion? Because motion seems to require both space and time, but also something that's actually moving.
That's a sharp observation. Kant struggled with this a bit.
Okay.
He recognized that motion was this kind of odd hybrid
Right.
that didn't fit neatly into either category.
All right.
But he makes this fascinating distinction between the motion of objects
Okay.
and what he calls motion as an act of the subject.
Okay.
It gets really deep when we get into his ideas about time and the transcendental logic.
Okay. We'll have to get there.
We will. Yeah.
But before we get there,
Yeah.
let's stick with time for a little bit longer.
Okay.
Kant gives time a certain priority over space, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
Yeah.
He sees space as the form of outer intuition,
Okay.
the way that we experience the physical world around us.
Right.
But time is the form of both outer and inner intuition.
Oh, okay.
It structures not only our perceptions of the world,
Okay.
but also our thoughts, our feelings, our entire inner experience.
So everything, both the physical and the mental, is ultimately structured by time.
That's how Kant sees it. And Heidegger really drives this point home,
Okay.
making it clear that time is absolutely foundational to how Kant understands the human mind.
My mind is officially doing
Ooh.
backflips.
It's pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah.
It is.
But I'm ready for more.
Okay.
So let's move on to how Kant explores thinking itself.
All right.
He divides it into general logic
Right.
and transcendental logic, right?
He does, yeah.
Yeah. So what's the distinction there?
General logic is all about the formal rules of thought, so how we form concepts
Okay.
and make judgments.
Okay.
So it's like the basic grammar of the mind.
So like the operating system of the mind.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
Yeah, like the software that runs everything.
Okay.
But Heidegger points out that transcendental logic actually goes a step further.
Okay.
It asks not just how thoughts connect with each other,
Okay.
but how they connect to objects in the world.
Okay.
How our thinking relates to reality itself.
So this is where things get really meta.
It does get pretty meta.
Yeah, we're not just talking about how thoughts work,
Right.
but how thought is even possible
You got it.
in the first place.
That's exactly right. Transcendental logic digs into the very possibility of knowing anything at all.
Okay.
And this is where Kant's work gets truly groundbreaking.
I'm starting to see why this is such a big deal.
It is, yeah.
So we can't talk about Kant's theory of knowledge without bringing up his idea of categories.
Right.
These are these fundamental concepts that our minds use to structure the world.
Yes, those are the big ones. Think of them as the fundamental building blocks
Okay.
of how we understand the world.
Okay.
Things like substance,
Right.
causality, possibility.
Right.
But Heidegger critiques Kant for not fully explaining
Yeah.
where these categories come from.
Right. If they're not derived from experience, where do they come from?
That's the big question.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery.
It is. And this is actually where Kant's investigation takes another really fascinating turn.
Okay.
He realizes that there's more to knowledge
Yeah.
than just logic and concepts.
Okay, now you've really got me intrigued. What else is he adding to the mix?
He identifies something called a threefold synthesis at work
Okay.
in how we experience the world.
Threefold synthesis.
Yes.
Lay it on me.
Okay, so it's about how we take in sensory information
Okay.
and make sense of it.
Okay.
The three parts are apprehension, reproduction, and recognition.
All right, so let's break those down one by one.
Okay.
What is apprehension?
Apprehension is that initial grasp of a bunch of sensations, a flash of color, a sound, a texture.
Okay.
Imagine you're walking through a forest, right?
Okay.
You see this blur of green, you hear the rustling leaves,
Yeah.
you feel the rough bark of a tree.
Okay.
That's apprehension, taking in all that raw sensory data.
So it's like the initial download of information from our senses.
Exactly.
Okay.
Then comes reproduction,
Okay.
holding on to those sensations even after they've passed.
Right.
It's like a mental echo, allowing us to compare
Okay.
and connect different experiences over time.
So if apprehension is like taking a snapshot, reproduction is like saving that snapshot to our memory.
Perfect analogy.
Okay.
And then finally, there's recognition,
Okay.
identifying those sensations as belonging to a particular object.
Okay.
So you see the blur of green, hear that rustling, feel that rough bark, and you recognize that's a tree.
So the three parts work together to take that raw sensory input
Yes.
and turn it into like a coherent experience of an object in the world.
You nailed it. But here's where things get really wild.
Okay.
Heidegger points out that Kant attributes this whole process of synthesis not to logic,
Okay.
but to the power of imagination.
Wait, imagination. I thought that was for like daydreaming and making stuff up, not for basic knowledge.
Right. It seems kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But Kant is giving imagination a much, much deeper role here.
Okay.
He sees it as this blind but indispensable faculty
Okay.
that allows us to weave our experiences
Yeah.
into a coherent world.
So are you saying that without imagination? We just have like this jumble of random sights and sounds and feelings.
That's exactly right.
We wouldn't be able to make sense of anything.
We wouldn't.
Okay.
Imagination is what allows us to connect those sensations over time,
Okay.
to recognize patterns,
Yeah.
and build a coherent understanding of the world around us.
All right. My mind is officially blown again.
Good. Yeah.
This is,
It's amazing stuff.
yeah. And from what I'm gathering, this is where Kant's ideas about time and imagination start to get really intertwined, right?
You're right on track. And this leads us into some of the most mind-bending ideas in all of philosophy.
Okay.
Kant argues that time isn't just something we experience.
Okay.
It's actually how the mind affects itself.
Whoa, hold on a second. The mind affecting itself through time. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Think of it this way. Kant sees time as the form of both outer and inner intuition, right?
Okay.
It's the structure, not only of our perceptions of the external world,
Okay.
but also of our internal experiences,
Uh,
our thoughts, our feelings, and that constant sense of self-awareness that we call the I think.
okay, so the I think isn't like this like static thing. It's a process
Yes.
unfolding in time.
Exactly. And this unfolding, this movement of the I think through time is actually what Kant calls motion as an act of the subject.
Oh, okay.
It's the way that the mind creates its own continuity
Okay.
and its own coherence
Okay.
through its relationship with time.
So our sense of self, that I feeling, it's like a river, like constantly flowing through time.
It is.
Never the same from one moment to the next.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Okay.
And it gets at the core of what Kant is. He's saying
yeah.
our minds are not just passive observers of time.
Yeah.
They're active participants in creating their own temporality.
This is some serious brain-stretching stuff.
It is.
But I'm loving it. This is why we do these deep dives,
Thank
to
you.
encounter these like mind-bending ideas.
That really shake up how we see the world.
Exactly.
And I completely agree. And we're really just scratching the surface of what Heidegger has to say.
About Kant.
Well, then, let's keep diving.
All right.
We've still got to untangle that transcendental deduction
Yes, we do.
you mentioned earlier.
A big one.
And I have a feeling it's going to be a wild ride.
It's going to be a wild ride.
Buckle up, everybody.
Buckle up. So the transcendental deduction, are you ready to tackle that?
Honestly, the phrase transcendental deduction sounds a little intimidating,
Yeah, I can see that.
like something a lawyer would throw around in court.
Haha. Yeah, think of it this way, though. Kant is, he's building a case for how our knowledge works.
Okay.
He's essentially trying to prove that our knowledge isn't arbitrary,
Right.
that there's this really deep connection between the way our minds are structured
Okay.
and how the world is structured.
So he's like defending our very ability to know things. Exactly. He's saying, look, these pure concepts, these categories, they're not just things we made up.
Right.
They're fundamental to how we experience and understand the world.
Okay. I see the logic there, but how does he actually make his case? What's his evidence?
Well, Heidegger points out that Kant's approach is a little roundabout,
Okay.
and he offers some critiques of his own.
So it's like Heidegger saying, okay, Kant, I see where you're going with this, but you could have gotten there more directly.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah,
Yeah.
Heidegger's always encouraging us to think deeper,
Right.
to question our assumptions,
Yeah.
and to consider different perspectives.
Right, which is exactly why he's such a great guide through Kant.
Right.
Um, so before we get too lost in the weeds of
Yeah.
the transcendental deduction,
Okay.
can we zoom out for a second and like for someone who's just starting to explore Kant, what are the key takeaways?
That's a great question. I think there are three big ones. The first one being that Kant is showing us that our minds aren't just passively soaking up information.
Okay.
They're actively shaping how we experience the world.
So we're not just like blank slates.
Right.
We bring something to the table.
Yes.
Our minds have this like built-in structure
Mhm.
that shapes how we see things.
Exactly. Second, he argues that this structure is a priori.
Great.
It's there before any experience.
Okay.
And one of the most basic parts of this a priori structure
Yeah.
is how we experience space and time.
Right. So space and time aren't out there in the world the way we usually think of them. They're the lens through which we perceive the world.
Precisely. And then the third key takeaway
Okay.
is that this a priori structure of our minds is what makes it possible for us to have objective knowledge.
So even though our minds are actively shaping our experience,
Yeah.
we can still have knowledge that's grounded in reality.
That's what Kant's ultimately arguing for.
Okay.
And this is where those categories come in. They're like the fundamental building blocks of thought that allow us to connect our a priori intuitions
Okay.
to the objects we experience in the world.
Okay, so let me see if I'm putting the pieces together correctly here.
Yeah.
So we have these a priori forms of intuition,
Yes.
like space and time,
Mhm.
that are built into our minds.
Oh, great.
Then we have these categories like substance and causality,
Yes.
which are also a priori.
Yes.
And these categories are what allow us to take all the raw sensory data that we receive
Yes.
and organize it into these meaningful experiences of objects.
You got it.
Did I get that right?
You got it. You're really starting to get the hang of this.
Well, I have a fantastic teacher.
Oh, stop.
But let's go back to this idea of motion as an act of the subject,
Okay.
which you mentioned earlier.
Right.
I'm really curious about how that fits into Kant's overall picture.
Right. So this is where things get really mind-bending.
All right.
Remember, Kant is trying to understand how pure concepts, which are a priori, can relate to objects in the world, which we experience empirically.
Right.
And motion, as we discussed, is this strange hybrid.
Right.
It seems to need both a priori and empirical elements.
Right. It needs space and time, which are a priori, but also something that's actually moving, which we can only know through experience.
Exactly. So Kant has to come up with a way to bridge this gap
Okay.
between the a priori and the empirical.
Right.
He does this by suggesting that there's a type of motion
Okay.
that's not about objects moving through space,
Right.
but about the subject itself, the I think, moving through time.
Okay, wait, slow down for a second.
Okay.
The I think is moving through time.
Think back to how Kant sees time as the form of both outer and inner intuition.
Okay.
It's not only the structure of our perceptions of the external world,
Okay.
but also of our internal experiences, our thoughts, our feelings,
Right.
and that continuous sense of self-awareness that we call the I think.
Okay, so the I think isn't a static thing, it's a process.
Right. That unfolds in time.
Got it.
Okay.
And this unfolding, this movement of the I think through time,
Okay.
is what Kant calls motion as an act of the subject.
Okay.
It's how the mind creates its own continuity, its own coherence
Okay.
through its relationship with time.
So our sense of self, that I think, it's constantly like being created anew in each moment
Yeah.
as we move through time.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a radical idea.
Yeah.
Because it suggests that the mind isn't just passively observing time,
Right.
it's actively participating
Wow.
in creating its own temporality.
So we're not just in time, we're making time.
Exactly. This is what makes Kant's philosophy so revolutionary.
Okay.
He's not just trying to describe the world as it is,
Yes.
but to understand how our minds make the world intelligible in the
Right.
first place.
I can see why Heidegger was so drawn to Kant.
Yes.
They're both wrestling with these really deep questions about the nature of being,
Absolutely.
knowledge, and time. And they're doing it in a way that's so thought-provoking.
Yes.
Even if it's not always, easy to grasp.
Right. And that's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it?
It is.
It challenges us to think beyond our everyday assumptions.
Yes.
And to confront those big, like, existential mysteries.
Exactly.
All right, I'm ready for another challenge.
Okay.
Let's dive back into the transcendental deduction.
Okay, let's do it.
How does Kant tie all of this together?
Okay.
The categories, the power of imagination, motion as an act of the subject, to his argument for the possibility of a priori knowledge.
Okay, so remember, the transcendental deduction is Kant's attempt to justify
Yeah.
how we can have knowledge that's both a priori,
Okay.
independent of experience,
Yeah.
and yet still about the world, about the objects we encounter.
Okay.
He's trying to show that these pure concepts, these categories,
Yeah.
they're not just random, they're essential for us to even have an experience of the world.
Right. Like we said earlier, he's defending our very right to have knowledge.
Exactly.
So how does he go about doing that? Where does he even begin?
So Kant starts by acknowledging that we can't have knowledge of things in themselves.
Okay.
We only have access to the world as it appears to us, filtered through the structure of our minds.
Right. Kind of like that sunglasses analogy we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Mm.
But then he takes this idea a step further.
Okay.
He says that this appearing, the way the world shows up for us, isn't passive.
Okay.
It's not like the world is just out there.
Right.
And our minds are passively receiving impressions of it.
Okay.
Instead, our minds are actively involved
Okay.
in shaping how the world appears to us.
Okay. I'm following so far, but how does this act of shaping work? Like what's the mechanism behind it?
This is where the categories and the power of imagination come in.
Okay.
Kant argues that the categories are these a priori concepts
Yeah.
that our mind used to structure our experience.
All right.
They're like the rules of the game.
Okay.
The framework that allows us to take all that raw sensory data that we receive
Okay.
and make sense of it.
Right. We talked about categories like substance and causality.
Exactly. And Kant says that these categories aren't derived from experience.
Okay.
They're a priori. They're built into the structure of our minds.
Okay, but how do these a priori categories actually get applied to the empirical world? Like how do they connect to the things that we experience?
This is where the power of imagination comes in.
Okay.
Remember, Kant sees imagination as this blind but indispensable faculty
Right.
that's responsible for synthesizing our experiences into a coherent world.
Okay.
And he argues that it's the power of imagination
Yeah.
that applies the categories
Yeah.
to the manifold of intuition, to all that raw sensory data that we're constantly bombarded with.
So imagination acts like a bridge
That's a great way to put it.
between the a priori
Yeah.
and the empirical.
You got it. Yeah, it takes these abstract categories,
Okay.
like substance and causality,
Yeah.
and it uses them to organize our perceptions
Right.
into meaningful experiences of objects.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Good.
But what about motion as an act of the subject? How does
Right.
that factor into all this?
Right. So recall that motion as an act of the subject
Okay.
is Kant's explanation for how the mind constitutes itself,
Right.
how it creates its own continuity and coherence
Yeah.
through its relationship with time.
Right. We talked about how the mind is making time as much as it's in time.
Precisely. And Kant argues that this self-constitution of the mind through time
Yeah.
is actually the basis for how we apply categories to the world.
Okay.
It's only through this ongoing process of self-creation,
Right.
this motion as an act of the subject,
Right.
that the mind can bring unity and coherence to all that raw sensory data we receive.
So the mind's self-creation through time is what makes it possible for us to experience the world as unified and coherent.
Exactly. And this unity and coherence is what allows us to have objective knowledge. Knowledge that's not just about our subjective experiences, but about the world itself.
Wow. I think I'm finally starting to grasp
Yeah.
how Kant puts it all together.
Yeah.
He essentially saying that our minds aren't just passively receiving information,
Right.
they're actively creating the conditions for knowledge itself.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And it's such a radical idea
Yeah.
because it challenges that traditional view of the mind as just a mirror
Right.
reflecting nature.
Right.
Kant's arguing that the mind isn't a mirror, it's more like a projector,
Okay.
casting its own light onto the world.
And that light is shaped by these a priori forms of intuition,
Yes.
like space and time,
Right.
and by those a priori categories like substance and causality.
Exactly. And it's the power of imagination,
Yeah.
guided by that motion as an act of the subject, that brings those a priori elements together with all that sensory data that we receive,
Yeah.
creating the world as we experience it.
This is seriously blowing my mind.
It's pretty amazing.
Kant is essentially saying that we are co-creating reality
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
with the world.
We're not just passive observers.
Yeah.
We're active participants
Right.
in creating meaning and knowledge.
Okay, I need a second to process all of this.
Take your time.
But before we move on, can we talk about like Heidegger's role in all this?
Yes.
He's not just explaining Kant, he's offering his own like interpretation.
Right, absolutely. Heidegger's a brilliant philosopher in his own right,
Right.
and he's not afraid to critique Kant where he sees fit.
So where does he agree with Kant and where does he like push back?
Well, Heidegger agrees with Kant that our understanding of being
Okay.
is fundamental to how we experience and know the world.
Okay.
He also agrees that time is a crucial element
Okay.
in this understanding.
So they're on the same page about the importance of being and time.
Yes, but Heidegger critiques Kant for not going far enough in his analysis of time.
Okay.
He thinks that Kant gets stuck in this traditional linear view of time as a series of moments.
Okay, so Heidegger is pushing for a more like radical understanding of time.
He is. He wants us to think about time not just as a container for events,
Right.
but as the very ground of possibility for being itself.
That's a pretty significant shift in perspective.
It is. And it leads Heidegger to develop his own unique philosophy of time,
Okay.
which we won't get into today,
Right.
but it's definitely worth exploring further.
Okay. Noted. Adding that to my reading list.
Good.
But for now, let's stick with Kant.
All right.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
but there's one key piece of the puzzle that
Yeah.
we haven't discussed yet, and that is the schematism.
Ah, yes, the schematism. This is where Kant really gets into the nitty-gritty of how the categories, which are a priori concepts,
Right.
get applied to the manifold of intuition,
Right.
all that raw sensory data
Yeah.
that we receive.
Okay, I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty, bring on the schematism.
All right, so Kant realized that there's this fundamental problem
Okay.
with trying to connect pure concepts
Okay.
like substance and causality
Yeah.
to concrete experiences,
Okay.
like seeing a tree or feeling the wind on your face.
Right. It's like trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
Exactly, because pure concepts are abstract and universal,
Right.
while experiences are concrete in particular.
Okay.
So Kant needed a way to bridge this gap.
And that's where the schematism comes in.
Precisely. The schematism is Kant's solution to this problem.
Okay.
It's his way of explaining how those abstract, a priori categories can be applied
Okay.
to the concrete empirical world that we live in.
Okay, but how does it actually work? Like what is a schema?
This is where things get a little tricky. Kant defines a schema as a transcendental determination of time.
A transcendental determination of time. You're going to have to break that down for me.
I know, right? It sounds like you need a philosophy degree to understand that one.
Yeah.
But let's unpack it together.
Okay.
So first, remember that for Kant, time is this fundamental a priori structure
Right.
of our minds.
Right. We've talked about that quite a bit.
Yes,
Time is the stage on which everything else plays out.
exactly. And a schema, according to Kant, is a way of determining time
Yeah.
in relation to a particular category.
Okay, I'm still not quite grasping it.
Okay,
Could you give me an example?
sure. Let's take the category of causality.
Okay.
The idea that every event has a cause,
Right.
right? So how do we actually apply this abstract concept
Yeah.
to our real-world experiences?
Well, we see things happen in a certain order and
Yeah.
we infer that one thing caused another.
Exactly. And Kant says that this inference is based on a schema of causality, which is a transcendental determination of time.
Okay.
In this case, the schema is the idea of a necessary succession of events in time.
So the schema of causality is like a rule that says if event A happens before event B, then A must have caused B.
That's a simplified way to put it,
Okay.
but you got the right idea.
Okay.
The schema provides a temporal framework
Right.
for understanding the category of causality.
Okay, so the schema is like a link
Yes.
between the abstract concept and the concrete experience.
Exactly. It's what allows us to take this abstract idea of causality
Okay.
and apply it to the real world
Okay.
that we experience.
This is starting to make a lot more sense.
Good. Good.
So is Kant saying that each category has its own schema, its own like way of determining time?
That's exactly what he's arguing.
Okay.
He goes through a whole list of categories and their corresponding schemata.
Okay, we probably don't need to go through the whole list here.
Right.
But can you give me another example just to really solidify this idea?
Absolutely. Let's take the category substance.
Okay.
So this is the idea that there's some underlying permanent thing
Yeah.
that exists even as its properties change.
Right.
Now, how do we actually experience substance?
Well, we see objects
Yeah.
that seem to persist over time, even if they, move or change their appearance.
Exactly. And Kant says that this experience is based on a schema of substance,
Okay.
which is a transcendental determination of time.
Right.
In this case, the schema is the idea of permanence in time.
So the schema of substance is like a rule that says if something appears to exist continuously through time, then it
Yeah.
must be a substance.
You're simplifying it a bit, but yes, the schema provides that temporal framework for understanding the category of substance.
Okay, I think I'm really starting to grasp how this schematism works.
Good.
It seems like Kant is saying that time is the key to unlocking
Yes.
how the a priori connects to the empirical world.
You are spot on. Time acts as this bridge, the mediator, allowing us to apply these abstract a priori concepts to the concrete, ever-changing world we experience.
And the schemata are the specific rules, the blueprints that guide this application.
That's a fantastic way to put it. They're like the instruction manuals
Okay.
for how to use the categories in
Yeah.
the real world.
Okay. This is all starting to come together.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, like, what does Heidegger think about all this? Does he buy into Kant's schematism?
Heidegger actually has some pretty strong critiques
Okay.
of Kant's schematism.
Right.
He thinks Kant is still too focused on that traditional linear view of time as a series of moments.
Right. We talked about how Heidegger wants us to think about time in this more like radical way as the ground of possibility for being itself.
Exactly. And he thinks Kant's schematism, with its emphasis on these temporal rules and blueprints,
Yeah.
doesn't quite capture the full depth
Right.
and complexity of our experience of time.
So Heidegger is challenging us to go beyond Kant, to develop an even more like nuanced understanding of time.
He is, and this is part of what makes Heidegger such an important figure in 20th century philosophy.
Right.
He's taking Kant's insights
Yeah.
as a starting point and then pushing them further,
Right.
asking even more fundamental questions
Right.
about the nature of being, time, and existence.
Okay, I'm definitely adding Heidegger to my reading list.
Good.
But for now, let's stick with Kant.
Okay.
We've covered a lot, but
Well-
there's still a lot more to unpack with the Transcendental Deduction.
There is.
What else is there?
Well, all these elements that we've discussed, the categories, the power of imagination, the schematism,
Right.
they all come together in Kant's final argument
Okay.
for the possibility of a priori knowledge.
Right.
He's trying to show that these pure concepts, these categories, they aren't just arbitrary.
Right.
They're actually essential for us to experience and understand the world at all.
Right. Like we said earlier, he's defending our very right to have knowledge.
Exactly. And he does this by arguing that the categories aren't just something that we impose on the world.
Okay.
They're actually embedded in the very structure of our minds.
Okay.
And this structure, in turn,
Yeah.
is what makes it possible for us to experience the world
Okay.
as a unified, coherent whole.
Okay, so the categories aren't random. They're grounded in the a priori structure of our mind.
Precisely. And this structure is grounded in our experience of time,
Right.
which for Kant is the most fundamental form of intuition.
So it's like time is the bedrock, the foundation
That's a brilliant way to put it.
upon which all of our knowledge is built.
Yes. And it's through the schematism,
Yeah.
that transcendental determination of time,
Right.
that the categories can connect
Okay.
to the empirical world to the objects that we experience.
So it's like time is the key, the missing link
You got it.
that unlocks how the a priori and the empirical world come together.
You got it. And this is the heart of Kant's transcendental deduction.
Okay.
He's demonstrating that our a priori knowledge isn't just about abstract concepts.
Yeah.
It's actually about the world, about the objects that we experience.
But it's not just a passive reflection of the world. It's an active, like, co-creation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kant is saying our minds aren't just mirrors
Right.
passively reflecting reality.
Right.
They're projectors, casting their own light onto the world, shaping how the world appears to us.
And this is what makes knowledge itself possible.
Precisely. Without this a priori structure,
Okay.
without this shaping power of the mind,
Yeah.
we would just be bombarded with this chaotic jumble of sensations.
Right.
We wouldn't be able to experience the world as a unified, coherent whole.
Right.
And we wouldn't be able to have objective knowledge.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense,
But-
but I have to admit, Kant is definitely not for the faint of heart.
He's not, but you
Yeah.
know, he's considered one of the most important philosophers of all time for a reason.
He's grappling with those really, really fundamental questions about the nature of reality knowledge and the human mind.
Yeah.
And even though his answers are complex and demanding,
Right.
they're so incredibly rewarding to work through.
I agree. And having Heidegger as our guide
Yes.
makes this journey even more like enriching.
Absolutely, because Heidegger helps us see Kant's insights in a new light,
Right.
appreciate their depth,
Yeah.
and push them even further,
Yeah.
asking those even more fundamental questions about being, time, and what it means to exist.
Well, I'm ready for more Heidegger.
All right.
But I think we've explored enough Kant for one deep dive.
I think so too.
So let's keep this philosophical momentum going here.
Okay.
I feel like I've leveled up
Leveled up.
in my understanding of existence itself, thanks to this deep dive.
Good.
It's amazing how Heidegger can take these like really dense, really abstract ideas.
And make them feel so relevant to our everyday lives.
He does have that knack, you know. He reminds us that philosophy isn't just about these heady concepts floating around in the ether.
Oh, yeah.
It's about understanding what it means to be human,
Yeah.
to grapple with those big questions of meaning and purpose,
Right.
and to find our place in the grand scheme of things.
And speaking of our place in things,
Yeah.
one of the ideas that really resonated with me from Heidegger
Okay.
was this notion that knowledge is a unique possibility of human existence.
Yes.
It's not just something that happens to us.
Yeah.
It's something we actively do.
Right, exactly.
Something we engage in as part of being in the world.
That's such a crucial point. You know, Heidegger's highlighting that knowledge isn't about passively absorbing information like a sponge.
Right.
It's about actively interacting with the world, like wrestling with it,
Yeah.
trying to make sense of it,
Right.
and ultimately creating meaning.
Right.
And this very act of meaning making, this drive to understand,
Right.
is a defining characteristic of what it means to be human.
Yeah, it's like we're all on this quest for knowledge, whether we consciously realize it or not. We're constantly asking questions, searching for answers,
Right.
trying to figure out what it all means.
Exactly. And Heidegger sees this quest for knowledge as deeply intertwined with our relationship with time.
Okay.
Because as we've been discussing, time isn't just some external force
Right.
acting on us.
Right.
It's something that we're actively creating
Right.
through the choices we make, the actions we take,
Yeah.
the projects that we pursue.
Yeah, that connects back to Kant's idea of motion as an act of the subject.
Yes, it does.
The mind is constantly shaping and reshaping itself
Ah.
through time,
Yes,
creating its own like sense of continuity and coherence.
precisely. And Heidegger takes this idea even further,
Okay.
suggesting that our very understanding of being, our sense of who we are and what it means to exist, is fundamentally interwoven with our experience of time.
So time isn't just like a backdrop for our lives.
Right.
It's like the very fabric of our being.
You got it. And that realization has really profound implications for how we understand knowledge,
Okay.
meaning,
Yeah.
and the human condition as a whole.
Yeah, it's like Heidegger is saying that we're not just in time.
Right.
We're made of time.
Yeah.
And this like temporal nature of our being is what makes knowledge possible in the first place.
Exactly, because knowledge isn't just about accumulating facts.
Right.
It's about making sense of the world,
Yeah.
creating meaning,
Right.
and finding our bearings within this constant flow of time.
Right.
And we can only do that
Yeah.
if we grasp that deep connection between our own being and our experience of time.
This is seriously mind-blowing stuff.
It
It
is.
is making me like rethink everything I thought I knew about knowledge.
That's the beauty of these deep dives, right?
Yeah.
They challenge us to question our assumptions, to
Yeah.
expand our horizons, and to
Right.
see the world from a completely fresh perspective.
I totally agree. And I think this deep dive has been particularly mind expanding
Yeah.
because we've had the guidance of not one, but two philosophical giants, Kant and Heidegger.
Yeah. And they're both grappling with these really fundamental questions about the nature of being,
Right.
knowledge, and time.
Right.
And even though their approaches might differ in certain ways,
Yeah.
their work complements and enriches each other
Right.
in such a remarkable way.
Yeah, it's like we're eavesdropping on a conversation
I love that analogy.
between these like brilliant minds across centuries.
It's important to remember that conversation is still ongoing.
Right.
Kant and Heidegger have given us these really invaluable insights,
Yeah.
but they haven't answered all the questions.
Oh, right.
There's still so much more to explore and discover.
Absolutely. And that's what makes philosophy so captivating, right?
That is,
It's not about finding like the final answers. It's
Yeah.
about this never-ending quest
Yeah.
for understanding.
journey.
It's a journey.
It never really reaches a final destination.
I couldn't agree more.
So what stands out to you
Yeah.
from this deep dive?
Honestly, my head is still spinning with all these new ideas.
Uh-huh.
But I think what keeps coming back to me is this idea of time
Okay.
as the very fabric of our being.
Yes.
It's making me like reflect on my own life, my own choices,
What?
and my own experiences in a completely new way.
That's wonderful because ultimately philosophy isn't just about these, abstract theories.
Right.
It's about living a more thoughtful and meaningful life.
So well said. And on that note, I think
Yeah.
it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
Okay. I'm all ears.
If, as Kant suggests, the mind is constantly creating and recreating itself through time,
Yes.
could our understanding of time be the key to unlocking
Even
deeper mysteries of consciousness itself?
that is a brilliant question, and one that I suspect philosophers will be grappling with for generations to come.
Indeed. So to all our listeners out there,
Yes.
keep pondering, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into those mysteries of existence.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time.